It's about music licensing for your media projects. On this episode of Legit Podcast Pro, I'm Gordon Firemark, and here we are. So, you've got the perfect song in mind for your media project, but what about the specific recording of that song? Did you know that licensing the recording is a separate process? Well, today we're diving deep into music licensing, including how to license both the composition and the master recording from the record label and the publisher, respectively. Actually, the inverted. Anyway, we'll do that. Stick around. Welcome back to Legit Podcast Pro. I'm a little bit froggy with a sore throat and cough today, but I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. And I am, today, we're going to look at the essential process of music licensing for your podcast or other media kinds of projects. Licensing is the legal permission you need to use music or other third party created content without dealing with potential copyright issues. So, what does music licensing really mean? Well, essentially, it means that you need two main licenses to use most songs legally. First off, there's the synchronization license, also called a sync. That covers the song's composition, the notes, lyrics, and melody written by the songwriters or the composer. And then you also need the master use license. This is a permission to use the particular recording of that song, that composition, and that's usually owned by the record label. So today we're going to talk about how to do it using ASCAP's repertoire database to identify and contact rights holders, but we'll also be covering how to get that from that master use license as well from the record company. And the tools that we're talking about, the ASCAP database, all of the big performing rights organizations have those. So if you don't find what you're looking for on ASCAP, you'll refer to bmi.com or CSAC's website, that kind of thing. Anyway, let's get into it and how you go about it. The first step in music licensing is identifying obviously what the music you want to use is, but then you need to identify who are the rights holders for that particular piece of music and the recording. So to find out who are the holders of the composition of the song, you want to use the tool at ASCAP's website, ascap.com, and you're going to click on the search and select the repertoire search. Now, before we go too far, I just want to talk a little bit about ASCAP and its brethren. ASCAP is what the music industry calls a performing rights organization. They, along with BMI, CSAC, and GMR, which stands for Global Music Rights here in the States, and outfits like SOCAN in Canada and PRS in the UK, and there are analogs for these in most countries around the world. They are in the business of collecting royalties for what we refer to as the so-called small performing rights in music. That's radio airplay, performances in clubs, bars, restaurants, theaters, those kinds of things. You will hear lots of podcast folks telling you just license it from the PROs, from ASCAP, but that is not really a viable solution. You see, licensing through the performing rights organization like ASCAP or BMI or CSAC isn't going to be enough when you want to use a specific song in a media project because the PROs only handle those small performance rights. But to use music in a podcast or a video or any other kind of media project, you also need different kinds of licenses. The synchronization license, which we'll talk about in a second, and the master use license for the recording. The PROs don't provide these, so you'll need to negotiate directly with the song publisher, the music publisher for the sync license, and with the record label for that master use license. Relying on the PRO license alone could leave you open to copyright issues because it doesn't cover things like embedding the music into your content. It really just allows for a play in specific kinds of public and digital settings. But ASCAP does provide this valuable tool that helps us identify who owns and controls the music so we can deal with them directly. First off, go to ascap.com, click on that search, and navigate to repertoire and search for your song by title, artist, or writer. This will give you the information about who owns the composition rights. Often it's the songwriters or the publishers. And then what you want to do is figure out who to contact. Once you find the song on the database, you may see multiple publishers listed down there under the composition. Usually that's in the bottom right, and you may need to expand those things. So you'll need to reach out to each one of the publishers or those people listed to obtain the synchronization license. Unfortunately, you do have to license 100% of the song in the way the business operates. Step 3 then is to contact those publishers and request the licensing terms. So once you have their contact information, you're going to reach out to them and start negotiating the terms. Now, be clear about what you're going to do with, the nature of the use, how long the clip is, and how you plan to distribute. And it probably makes sense to talk about this, how many downloads you have or the scope of your audience to give a sense of things. So you're going to negotiate the fees, and that's really the next step. The publishers will have different licensing fees depending on audience size, project type, the extent of your use, and so on. And once you reach the agreement with each of the rights holders, then you need to get it all down in a written license agreement. That's the legal document that confirms that you have permission to use the song's composition, and that's the sync license. Once you've done that, you have to duplicate that process with respect to the master use license. That's the right to use the specific recording that you have in mind. So let's say you want to use a particular artist's version of "Oh My Darling Clementine." Well, that's a bad example because it's in the public domain. Of "Twist and Shout," let's say, you would need to get the master use license from the record label that represents that particular recording, that artist, that album. And the rights that you need to license for this are, like I said, owned typically by the record company. So to go about that, identify the record company that owns the recording. Usually that's going to be on liner notes, or you can look on the up the track on Spotify or YouTube or whatever. And mostly the record companies, Sony Music, Universal Music Group, Warner Music Group, they typically own the big artists' music. So contact the label's licensing department. Most of these companies will have an online licensing or contact link on their website. And if available, use their designated form or email to submit your licensing inquiry. That's the same is true for the publishers. Once you get into that form, provide the specifics about the project. Make sure you include key details, the length of the clip, where and how it's going to appear, the project's distribution channels and scope of things, the size of your audience and expected reach. This will help them assess your project scope and figure out the right fees, which you then negotiate directly with them. Labels do typically charge a license fee, depending on how you plan to use the recording and how long and the nature of your project. So these rates can vary widely, so don't be surprised if it seems a little high. It's okay to ask for a lower number. It's okay to ask for free permission. And for popular songs, the well-known artists, the well-known songs, those will command a premium. Lesser-known pieces will probably be more affordable. Get it in writing, just like with a sync license. The master use license has to be documented in a written deal. And then you have the legal permission that you need to include the song and that recording in the project. Now, remember, licensing a popular recording from a major label might be out of your budget. So consider other things like cover versions, which might come at a lower fee, or look at royalty-free or stock music libraries and get that license. Now, what would be included in a license agreement like this? Well, once you've made contact and started the negotiations, you're going to be talking about these essential terms. First off, it's the grant of rights. Specify that the agreement covers either the sync or the master use, or both. In some instances, that may be the case. Make sure it's clear about how you are allowed to use the music in your project, and make sure it covers all of the things you might need to do. Define how much of the song, the scope of the license, how much of the song you're going to use, and how often is it going to appear. Make sure you don't leave anything ambiguous or open-ended so you don't have misunderstandings. You'll also need to include the territory and the duration. So include specifics about where the project is going to be distributed and how long you'll have permission to use that song. If you're doing a podcast, you want it to be there forever, so you're looking for perpetual or in perpetuity rights. And podcasts are global, so you don't want to be in a situation of having to geo-fence the permissions to deal only with one part of the world if you can avoid it. So you're asking for worldwide in perpetuity rights. Detail where you're going to be distributing the project, the platforms, the YouTube streaming, and so on. Make sure that's explained in the license. And then there are going to be the payment terms. So outline the fees, the dates they're due. Are there royalties that are going to be due for ongoing use? Are there any renewals annually or anything like that? And finally, the licensor should issue warrants and warranties and representations. This is them confirming that they own the rights they're licensing, and that's how you protect yourself from future copyright claims by other parties. And finally, it's important to include an indemnity clause to cover any legal liability in case someone claims that you've infringed. You want to make sure that they're indemnifying you, and sometimes you have to indemnify them as well. Finally, a few things that you want to make sure you avoid or make sure are very, very clear. First of all, open-ended agreements can be dangerous. So make sure that if there are renewal terms are clear so you don't lose access to that music unexpectedly or face unexpected costs. Now, that worldwide in perpetuity is an open-ended deal, but it's pretty clear. I'd be more concerned about having limitations that can go by without you noticing, and then you get sued for infringement. Another thing to avoid in these deals is vague language about ownership. The agreement should specify that it's a license and not a transfer of ownership of the music, and it should include a specific description of what rights are being granted. I'll beware of hidden fees or revenue share provisions. You want to avoid these if you can, and unless you're really expecting to do a lot of percentage math and keep paying people royalties. You want to avoid those if you can. If you have these terms all nailed down, you will be able to protect yourself and respect the rights of the music's creators and owners. Now, a few more little tips. I know all this sounds a little complex and costly. Remember, there are alternatives. First of all, if you do negotiate these kinds of deals, most of the time the label and the publisher will issue the license agreements, the paperwork for you. But if you're working with an independent band or artist, head on over to podcastlawforms.com where you can get a music license for use with an independent artist, and make sure you get them to sign off on those terms. But if you still don't want to incur all the cost and complexity of using existing pop music, there are stock music libraries, there are royalty-free services, and there's the Creative Commons license for budget-friendly options without the need for separate license agreements for sync and master use. So that's going to wrap up our quick guide on music licensing, including all those essential terms that need to be covered in your license agreement. I hope this breakdown of both the sync and master use processes helps to make your licensing a little clearer and easier for you and your podcast or media productions. And for more legal resources and templates, like I said, visit podcastlawforms.com where you'll find agreements and forms tailored to podcasters so you can keep your show legally sound. That's podcastlawforms.com. And that's it. I'll say thanks for tuning in to Legit Podcast Pro. Keep creating, and as always, keep it legit and keep it legal. Thanks.